We are MythVision. Welcome to MythVision Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. I'm super excited once again to sit with Dr. Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. I'm sorry that we did a deep dive into like extremely meticulous, not giving you prep. Really, there wasn't any prep time, of course, for that kind of work. And
it's okay.
These were donor questions. Right. I know you'll do anything, but it's like, these were donor questions. Don't shoot the messenger, please.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. You ask me anything you want. I'll even tell you my shoe size.
Well, Dr. Bart D. Ehrman is the James A. Grade Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He came to UNC in 1988. After 4 years of teaching at Rutgers University at UNC, he has served as both the Director of Graduate Studies and the Chair of Department of Religious Studies. A graduate of Wheaton College, Illinois, Bart received both his Master's of Divinity and PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, where his 1985 doctoral dissertation was awarded magna cum laude. Since then, he has published extensively in the fields of New Testament and early Christianity, having written or edited 26 books, numerous scholarly articles, and dozens of book reviews. Among his most recent books are Greek-English edition of the Apostolic Fathers for the Loeb Classical Library, and that's the Harvard University Press, a scholarly monograph on the use of literary forgery in early Christianity, Oxford University Press, and 4 New York Times bestsellers. You really, really have to get these books. If you have not read this stuff, it will like shock you if you aren't acquainted with textual criticism stuff. So misquoting Jesus, I reread that the other day. You can't pass this book up. I'm telling you. God's Problem, Jesus Interrupted, and Forged. And he has the layperson's edition, which really I needed. And then there's Forgery, Counterforgery, which is more complex for scholars who want to think deep. Real quick, before we actually start, I want everybody to go to Amazon or go to bartdehrman.com, buy the books, check the books out. That's how you can help him support what he's doing to continue his research and to bring these ideas to the forefront. Because too often in America, I see the evangelical world is really dominating this topic. And I think more people need to be educated on it. I'm not a basher, no chip on my shoulder, but I found to love the Bible that much more knowing what it's actually doing and the humanity behind it than the mystical, magical, supernatural show. And that's just my personal opinion. Ladies and gentlemen, also, I release all this content early on Patreon. Help support us. Many scholars, Dr. Ronald Hindle on the dating of the Bible, even science about the brain. You know, Dr. Jason Staples recently interviewed him on the idea of Israel. We got lost in the weeds in the New Testament, even though his book mainly focuses on the Old. Dr. Dennis McDonald and Dr. Price, they had a discussion/debate over the historical Jesus, and on and on and on. I'm shortly plugging that to say, help support us here at MythVision. Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you for being patient through that. I guess we'll jump straight into the questions. But did you want to make a comment about our last show real quick?
It was great. It was great fun. Yeah. Did some Greek. How often does that happen on a podcast?
You did so well in terms of trying to make it simple for the audience, you know?
Well, it's complicated because, you have to it's kind of, you got to kind of know the Greek in order to understand the grammatical arguments. And a lot of people use Greek without being really knowing it. I mean, we've all had that experience of the pastor saying, "Oh, the Greek word means this," and it goes on, and half the time he doesn't really know. It's just like he read that someplace, but it's good. I mean, it's good that the pastors do go to the Greek, and it really does help. But it's a difficult language, and it's not easy to explain if you let you know something about it. So,
well, especially when you're hip firing too. Some of this stuff isn't simple. It takes time for you to really prep for, and I apologize for no prep. I didn't really give you anything to prep with, and you were going in the deep end. So, all right, first question, Dr. Ehrman. How do you explain Paul's apparent lack of knowledge about Jesus' life and teachings in his epistles? A favorite mythicist talking point. So, see, for example, his teaching on divorce compared to what Jesus said on the subject in the Gospels. Are the Greek passages that could be referencing Jesus ambiguous? E.g., James, the brother of the Lord, as biological or mystical? Now, what do you think about the life of Jesus? Not knowing the life of Jesus and Paul, though, pretty much.
Well, Paul does know about the life of Jesus. I mean, he quotes him, and he tells us some things. And so it's a very, very interesting issue, but it has nothing to do with whether Jesus existed or not.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So how often does Paul mention the Emperor Nero? Oh, well, he must not have existed then.
Right.
So, right. So Paul, but it's an interesting question. Apart from that, it's a very, very interesting question because Paul does not say much about the life of Jesus. He talks a lot about Jesus' death and resurrection. He says a lot about the crucifixion, a lot about the resurrection. But by the way, he wouldn't be able to be crucified if he didn't exist.
Right.
So just to point out,
that's actually one of the biggest, for me personally, that's one of the biggest ad hoc props to me, is the idea that he was crucified in the heavens. I'm not saying that's not possible, but it doesn't seem to make the most sense for me. It's like,
where do they get this from? I mean, seriously, how many ancient records talk about anyone being crucified in heaven? I can tell you how many. 0.
Right.
So why is it that's the likely thing that happened with Jesus? He was crucified in the heavens. What? That's the most probable thing, as opposed to the thousands and thousands of people who got crucified in the ancient world, including hundreds and hundreds in Jesus' day in Palestine. Come on.
You actually point this out that, and I think one of the things that you do that's balanced is you say, well, no, there is a strange Christology in Paul about a pre-existent angelic,
sure,
Christ coming down, but they looked at the guy and applied it to this person, mythologized the guy. So
I know. I mean, yes. Okay. So let's
next question.
No. Let's deal with this question because it's a really important question.
Yes.
So quite apart from the mythicist thing, which I mean, I'm just sorry. It's just okay. It's yeah. Apart from that, Paul does tell us some things, and he doesn't tell us a lot of things. And it's an interesting historical question. Why? So you can actually make a fairly quick list of the things Paul tells us about the historical Jesus, by which I mean between the time Jesus was born and the time he died. So the actual life period, apart from what he's doing now in heaven or what,
right,
or what he was doing before, but like the life. So Paul tells us he was born of a woman, which is not all that useful because that's how most of us were born. But he does say that in Galatians 4:4, and I think he's probably saying that precisely because people are saying things like he was a divine being and wasn't really. And he said, no, he's born of a woman. He says that he was Jewish. He says that he had brothers. He mentions his brothers on several occasions, and he names James as one of his brothers, whom Paul knows as Jesus' brother. He mentions the 12, which apparently means the 12 apostles. He says that Jesus ministered principally to Jews. He says that Jesus was crucified and all that. He says that he was killed by the Jews, by which he means the Jews were responsible. The Jewish leaders were responsible for Jesus' death. He quotes several sayings of Jesus. His saying that you shouldn't get divorced, Paul quotes and attributes it to the Lord. And he said, which is his common title for Jesus, Kurios, the Lord. And he says that Jesus taught, and he quotes Jesus, that you're supposed to pay the ones who are ministering to you. And so a workman is worthy of his hire, quotes that saying. And he quotes the extended discussion of Jesus at the Last Supper, where Jesus distributes the bread and the wine and says, "This is my body given for you, and this is the cup of my blood." And so he quotes him on those occasions. And so it's a puzzle why he doesn't say more. And there are a variety of options. One option is that he just, he had no occasion to say anything more. He's writing these letters. I think people forget, or people never think about it, that these are actually pieces of personal correspondence. Paul is writing to people who are having issues 6 of his 7 letters are directed to the 7 letters that everybody agrees he wrote. There are 13 letters attributed to him in the New Testament, but just about everybody agrees there's 7 of them he really did write. And then six of those 7 are sent to churches that he had founded, and that he felt responsible for, and they were having problems, and so he's writing to address their problems. And so he's not writing a life of Jesus. Right. He's not writing a gospel. It's like, I've probably written I don't know, 50 emails over the last couple of days, and I don't think I've mentioned anything about Jesus. And so it doesn't mean it's just because that's not why I was writing the email. It doesn't mean I don't know anything about Jesus. It just means that, maybe that these are, because they're called occasional letters, meaning they're written for particular occasions, that he wrote them, and he's just addressing those occasions. Another option is that he just really didn't care that much about the historical Jesus. What he really cared about, like what he did, he's just not that interested in his baptism or his healing or feeding the 5,000. He's like, it's just not what he's interested in, his death and resurrection, because that brings salvation. So that's what he talks about. Another option is he just doesn't know anything, doesn't know much about Jesus, the historical Jesus. That would be a little bit weird, because he knows, he knew Cephas, Jesus' primary disciple. He knew him personally, right. And he knew James, Jesus' brother, knows him personally. And this is really Jesus' brother. This is not some, the mythicists who come up with these weird ideas about who this is. It is Jesus' brother. And if you just read it, it's just like there's no doubt about that.
Right.
I can explain that if anybody wants. I can explain.
No, you're good, because I've got too many questions.
Okay, yeah, I know I'm going on this one, but it's a good one. So those are the options. Okay, yeah, go ahead. I'll be sure.
That was extremely well said. I do appreciate it, and I definitely side with that. Okay. How old are the earliest reasonably complete manuscripts of each of the 4 Gospels? Is it true the older the manuscripts, the greater the number of variants, to the point some passages may never correctly be ascertained, if you will, by scholars? When do you date the Muratorian fragment? So there's multiple questions into that, but is it true that the older, the more difficult variations?
It's an interesting situation that we have, and a complicated one. For the Gospels, the earliest fragment we have of anything, probably it's much debated. They're hard. It's hard to date manuscripts, because you usually don't carve and 14 date them, because to do that you've got to destroy part of the manuscript, and you don't want to do that. So especially if it's a little fragment. But so usually what they do is they date it on the basis of handwriting analysis. So there's an entire field of study, paleography, where people are trained, they're experts in dating manuscripts, Latin, Greek, Coptic manuscripts, on the basis of the handwriting. So the earliest fragment probably dates to sometime in the early 2nd century. It's just a little piece the size of a credit card. That's a little fragment from the trial of Jesus before Pilate in John chapter 18. So that's the earliest. The earliest kind of largely fragmentary, like multiple chapters for the Gospels, is around the year 200. And so maybe 120, 140 years after the Gospels have been written, we have some fragmentary manuscripts. The first complete, like the full thing, like Matthew to John, the whole thing, is from about 360 CE, so about 300 years later. Scholars who want to know what the original text said, like what did Matthew really write, of course, are inclined to look at the earliest manuscripts, because the earliest manuscripts are, you don't have as many scribes who might make mistakes en route. So the earlier the manuscript, the fewer chances for scribes to mess it up. So that's definitely what scholars want to do, is look at the earlier stuff. But there is this other problem this person mentions, which is that the earliest scribes were not trained to be scribes. These were not like professional scribes. Back into the days before Kinko's, you had to have scribes trained to copy, and trained scribes took years to be trained. And the people writing these manuscripts, they just happened to be the Christian in the church who could write. Most people couldn't. And so, like Joe Schwartz over here, he can write. Okay, yeah, copy this manuscript for it. And so he wasn't trained. And so often they would make mistakes, or they didn't think it was the Bible they were copying. They're just copying one of Paul's letters here, And so they weren't like that intent on making sure they didn't change a single letter. They changed a lot of letters and changed a lot of words. And so the task of textual criticism is figuring out how to get behind all of these mistakes to the original text and the text the author wrote, as much as you can. And the general thought is we're pretty close in almost every instance. I mean, it's, we're pretty close probably, but the questioner is absolutely right. There are passages we just don't know. And the way we know we don't know is because scholars disagree. Is it worded this way or is it worded that way? Yeah, it's kind of a big difference. Yeah, well, there aren't millions of passages like that, but there are dozens, hundreds probably, and hundreds, and they matter.
When do you date the Muratorian fragment, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so the Muratorian fragment is not a copy of the New Testament. It is a list of the books that this anonymous author thought belonged in the New Testament. So he's telling you it's our first list of, what are the Gospels, which epistles are, and so it's a list of books. It's in Latin. It's from the Middle Ages. It's terrible Latin, ungrammatical Latin. It's hard to read, but it is normally dated to have been originally written in Greek in the around the 180s, the end of the 2nd century. So it would be our earliest list of books, which includes our 4 Gospels, and it includes a lot of what we ended up with the New Testament. There are scholars who have argued, 20, 30 years ago, started arguing that in fact it's from the 4th century, and most of us don't buy that. Most of us think it actually is late 2nd century.
Interesting. Thank you so much. What criteria are used to determine which of Paul's epistles are authentic? If you don't mind just pointing out some of the criteria, and we'll just move forward.
Well, we have these 13 that are said to be written by Paul, plus some outside the New Testament. We have 3 Corinthians, for example. We have the letter to the Laodiceans. We have these other letters that claim to be written by Paul also. And so you have to figure out, well, did Paul write it or not? And so the basic idea is that we know that people were forging things in Paul's name because we have these things that everybody thinks were forged. And so the question, did any non-Pauline letters claiming to be Paul get into the New Testament? And the normal criteria are that there are a core of letters that have the same kind of writing style. They use the same kind of vocabulary. They have very similar theological ideas, and they seem to be well situated in the middle of the 1st century in terms of what the kind of historical situation they're presupposing. And there are other letters that seem to use a different writing style and different vocabulary, different theology. They seem to be presupposing a later situation. And so if you're in that latter group, people say, well, it's not cohering with this group that looks like it's all coherent. And so those are the criteria. And so you have the 7, they're called undisputed Pauline epistles, and then the Deutero Pauline by somebody claiming to be Paul who's not.
And I know there's so much more that it goes deep in his books. That's obviously it's more complex than that in terms of actually doing the work. But
doing the work is tricky. Trying to figure out Greek writing style, you compare. But if you read Mark Twain and you read James Joyce, you're not reading the same guy. Right. So you do that with ancient writings too, not just the New Testament, but this is just something that historians do. They compare writings for writing style, and you especially look for things that people don't think about when they write. Right. People have certain kind of ways they talk that they don't think it's just how they talk. And if you got people talking 2 different ways, it probably tells you something.
Thank you, Dr. Ehrman. Why do you believe the Gospel of John is stitched together from 4 other documents, and that 2 Corinthians is composed of at least 2 other letters? Are there other New Testament books that appear to be composed in a similar fashion?
I would say those 2 instances are different from one another. The Gospel of John does appear to have used certain sources of information. So in other words, whoever wrote the Gospel of John didn't sit down one day and make up a 21 chapter story about Jesus. Right. He's heard things, he's read things, and he's putting together what he has. And it looks like some of the things that he has are written sources, and you can tell for a variety of reasons, that including some internal inconsistencies where he'll say something and then the next chapter will say something else and it doesn't work. Right. And so the one explanation for that is that he's got several written sources and put them together. I wouldn't limit it to 4. I mean, the prologue, the first 18 verses comes from some other source, probably, where the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He's got a source that gives him his miracles that are called signs. He's got 7 signs in this gospel. He's got discourses that seem to come from a different source. And so all of these things end up being put together. Originally, probably John did not have chapter 21, which is the final chapter. It includes of course, some of Jesus' resurrection appearances. But it looks like originally it ended with chapter 20, verse 31, and that 21 was tacked on later, which makes things very, very interesting. There's, of course, complicated arguments to sustain that, but they're pretty convincing to most critical scholars. So that's more like Second Corinthians. Second Corinthians does look like it's made up of, almost all critical scholars agree that Second Corinthians is made up of two letters. That chapters 10 through 13 is one letter, and chapters 1 through 9 is a separate letter. And to make things especially confusing, it looks like in terms of chronology, what is now chapters 10 through 13 was the first of the two letters to be written. And some of us think there are actually 5 letters in First Corinthians, in Second Corinthians, 5 letters that have been spliced together. And you'd have to look at the arguments to see if you find them convincing or not. But I didn't come up with this. I mean, this has been around for a long time, and I find the arguments convincing. But what it means is that somebody probably in Corinth had some of Paul's letters and wanted to come up, with the greatest hits album. So he scissors and pasted them together into what we now have Second Corinthians. So that's a little bit different from what happened with John, because John's using sources, and Second Corinthians is different letters of Paul that they're put together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ehrman. That was well said. What do you consider the greatest manuscript discovery since the 1800s? Everyone knows about the discovery of the Gospel of Judas, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Nag Hammadi Library. However, the 19th century saw the discovery, and I'm going to butcher this, the Chechendorf of the Codex Sinaiticus at the Mount Catherine Monastery. In addition, there were the discoveries of the Gospel and Apocalypse of Peter, as well as the Didache, if you will. Which of these do you consider most important, if you will?
It depends. They're all really important for different things. Right. And so it depends what you're interested in. If you're interested in the history of Judaism in the days of Jesus, the most significant discovery was the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you're interested in how Jesus was understood by early Christians in a variety of ways, the most important discovery was the Nag Hammadi Library. If you're interested in what the words of the New Testament originally were, then probably the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus in the 19th century, or the discovery of the papyri. So really, it just depends what you're interested in. And since people are interested in different things, it's impossible to say which one of these things is the most important.
Too heavy of a question. Yeah. I appreciate it. What is your opinion about the Testimonium Flavianum in Flavianum, in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, the paragraph that talks about Jesus? Is it authentic or an insertion? What do you take? Partial interpolation, whole interpolation? What's your personal preference?
Yeah, so this is the passage in Josephus was this first century Jewish historian, just for background for everybody, who wrote a number of books, including a book called The Antiquities of the Jews, which is a history of the Jewish people from Adam and Eve up to his own day. It's quite a history. And so in book 18, he mentions Jesus twice in this 20-volume book, and once in chapter 20, once in book 20, and once in book 18. And in book 18, there's actually a full paragraph where he says some things of substance about how Jesus had that he was a speaker of great things, and he did great deeds, and he had followers, both Jews and Greeks, and the Jewish leaders were upset with him and handed him over, and he was crucified. And so it supports what the Gospels basically say, but it's just a brief paragraph. The thing is, that paragraph contains some statements that a non-believer in Jesus almost certainly would not say, such as he was the Messiah and he was raised from the dead according to the prophets. Yeah, probably not by Josephus. And so the question is the whole thing like just stuck in there, an interpolation from some other source, or is there actually an original thing there that scribes have added a couple lines to? Mm-hmm. And I think the best evidence is that it actually was there, and that scribes have just added a few lines to wamp it up a bit. Josephus' writings were preserved by Christians in the Middle Ages, not by Jews, because Jews always considered him as a turncoat, because they saw him as a traitor for what happened during the Jewish uprising that ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. And so they didn't copy his writings. So I think Christian scribes touched up the statement a little bit.
Thank you. What is your position regarding what occurs after death? Your recent book, of course, you discuss heaven and hell, and I ask everybody to go check it out. It's on Audible too, so if you can't read it in paper, it's definitely worth listening to. Really, did you read it yourself? No, I'm sorry, you had someone else read it, if I'm not mistaken. Either way,
I didn't read it.
Yeah, someone else did. What do you think happens when we die? Is the question ultimately?
Yeah, well, that's an easy one. I think we cease to exist. I think we are material beings, and I don't think that I think our entire universe is made up of matter in one way or another, and when we die, that's the end of our story.
Awesome. Well, that's where I'm at. So thank you so much. Do you believe there's a connection between some of the New Testament writings and Greek literature, a position advanced by others like Professor McDonald, Professor McDonald? He has
Dennis
his,
McDonald.
Mark and Homeric epics, Euripides, the Bacchae, and Acts. Do you think that there's some validity? And you probably don't conclude the complete mimesis connection directly from other texts, so to speak, but do you think he has some potential roots in the possibility that these authors, possibly Greeks themselves, aware, maybe they're God-fearers, who knows, some of the authors of the Gospels are utilizing Greek epics in some sense to write maybe Mark, or involved in the narrative? Do you think there's some validity to this?
So Dennis McDonald's a really, really smart scholar, very erudite, and he's and so he's he knows his stuff. I do not agree with this thesis that these books are largely based on the Greek tragedies and the Greek epics and so on. I don't think that there's very good evidence of that. I mean, I don't see Mark being modeled on Homer at all. Right. He has common motifs, but you have common motifs, in lots and lots of writings. And I think it's a huge stretch to think that these classical sources were somehow being models for how you write narratives like the Gospels and Acts. I don't think it's right.
So to put it simply, you're not denying there could be usage from it, especially being when you go to learn Greek, you're reading these things. So who knows, there's the potential of it being kind of in the air, that ideas are floating around, and someone who's a creative person writing a gospel might be utilizing something, but you're not saying that this is the template, mimesis connection right here. I'm going to use this to write my gospels, correct?
I don't know if Mark read Homer or not. I mean, I don't know. It's a different kind of Greek. It's hard Greek. It's a different kind of Greek. And so, unless he gives some indication, he doesn't use Homeric language particularly. Right. He doesn't show any evidence of being able to read epic Greek. Your readers can probably, the people listening to you can probably read Middle English if they're trained. If they have a few days being trained, they can probably read some Chaucer, but not a lot. But there'd be no evidence that anybody had unless they use that kind of language. And if you don't, so what's the evidence really? Is the evidence that it has similar motifs and that Jesus does things that kind of connected with the things that Odysseus does? Well, so I mean, I don't think it's not. I don't think it's very good evidence. But as I said, McDonald is a very, very bright guy, and so I think we have to take him seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, he speaks highly of you as well. When I talk to him, he's a great guy. You're right.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of a longer question. Question regarding the Epistle to the Hebrews, and what a clever, interesting book that is. More specifically, when was it written and by whom? For what I understand, it was added to the canon because some early Christians thought Paul wrote it, although now most believe he didn't. Due to its frequent reference to the tabernacle terminology, a case can be made it was composed before the destruction in 70 of the Jerusalem temple. More specifically, during the 60s, if correct, it would place Hebrews between the time Paul composed most or all of his epistles and the composition of Mark, the earliest gospel. Note, some scholars proposed it was written by a woman, although very few females during this period received the requisite education to produce such a document in eloquent Greek. When, who, why? You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah. No, they're all good questions, and there aren't slam dunk solid answers for any of them. In terms of who wrote it, we don't know. It doesn't claim to be written by Paul. Its writing style is completely different from Paul. Its theological concerns are completely different from Paul. Paul is, it's nothing like Paul, but it did come to be attributed to Paul, in part because at the very end, the author mentions Timothy, who was one of Paul's companions. And there's been some scholarship to suggest, there's a woman named Claire Rothschild who wrote an entire book arguing that, in fact, the author wants you to think it's Paul, and that putting that thing by Timothy at the end is a way an author trying to get you to think, yeah, actually, this is Paul, to increase its probability of being accepted. There's nothing to suggest it was a woman, and there's nothing, apart from the fact that very few women could write, to suggest it wasn't a woman. There's not particularly anything about it that make you think one way or the other, except for, you have very, very few women authors at the time. In the New Testament, we only know the actual name of one author, and that's Paul. I mean, the other books, we don't know their names. So
when would you date Hebrews, though?
So okay, I date Hebrews after 70. I think that the idea that it seems to presuppose that the temple is still functioning is an argument that I used to accept as well, until I realized that we have Jewish texts from late antiquity, from hundreds of years later, that talk about the temple as if it's functioning. And so it's when it talks about Judaism, when the book of Hebrews talks about Judaism, it does not seem to be referring to things going on in the author's own time. It seems to be referring to what's found in the Bible, biblical understanding. In other words, what's found in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And so there's very little reason to date it before 70. So I think it's sometime after 70. Yeah.
Interesting. The earliest extant reasonably complete Bibles are Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Both are dated between 320 and about 370, as you talked a little bit about this earlier, which would place them within the reign of Constantine the Great. Which one do you, Dr. Ehrman, think is more accurate, and why? Also, do you have an opinion if either one was of the 50 commissioned by the emperor? Note that neither codex includes the story of the woman taken in adultery, while Sinaiticus also includes the epistle of Barnabas and the shepherd of Hermas.
Yeah, I think they're dating it too early if they're saying in the reign of Constantine, who died in 337. Usually these are dated to 360 or so now. So that would not make them one of the 50 ordered by Constantine. Constantine wrote a letter to the church father Eusebius and asked for 50 Bibles to be produced. And people got all excited when they found these Bibles because they were pretty exotic productions. They're very handsome, and they thought, well, that would cost a lot of money. Maybe the emperor ordered them. Yeah, okay, maybe there are a lot of rich people in the empire. So they are very similar to each other in many ways. It's true that Sinaiticus does include two books that did not make it into the New Testament. So this would mean that in the year 360, you still have people who think that some of these other books should be part of the Bible. The Vaticanus is slightly more accurate in terms of its text. They're very similar to each other, but Vaticanus tends to be a little bit more accurate and tends to be the go-to. Some of the books in Sinaiticus have a lot more changes from what appear to be the original text than Vaticanus does.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you go subscribe to Theremin Trees, a fantastic channel that explores manipulative systems from an empirical social psychology and therapeutic perspective. It is woefully undersubscribed relative to its immense value. A great starting point is Bending Truth, How Adults Get Indoctrinated, which dives into some very specific methods that some cults use to systematically target adults into eventually believing outlandish claims. A major takeaway is that we are all vulnerable to manipulation, and the number one defense is simply awareness of that. Brilliant videos with superbly artistic style and decisively rational approach. The Recovering from Religious Foundation uses this channel for training because it is so wonderful. Please consider checking it out, subscribing, and sharing. Links are in the description below.